March-June 1944, Chapter 2, Harvey Point, North Carolina. In 1995, John Beers, the mayor of Hertford, North Carolina, wrote me and provided some background on Harvey Point. On Armistice Day, November 11, 1942, the Virginia Engineering Construction Company broke ground for a new Naval Auxiliary Air Station located on the historic spot formerly known as Harvey's Neck, now Harvey Point. This neck of rural land is located 60 miles south of Norfolk, Virginia, and 11 miles southeast of the town of Hertford, North Carolina, lying on a peninsula bounded by the Albemarle Sound, the Perkins River, and the Yopum River. The air station was commissioned on June 13, 1943, for the purpose of training seaplane squadrons. The cost was approximately $3,900,000. During the time of its existence, the air station was home to 18 squadrons, beginning with VP 209, which completed training on August 1, 1943, and completing operations with the departure of VP 201 on May 13, 1945. At given times, as many as 40 to 45 seaplanes were operating at Harvey Point. During our stay, there were 3 other squadrons also training there. We at Squadron VP 21 were the 5th squadron to deploy from there to the Pacific Theater in June 1944. The width of the Perkins River at Harvey Point is 3,000 yards, which made it unnatural for seaplane operations. When the base was completed, it was not a particularly sophisticated environment. Housing and maintenance facilities were marginal, prepared men for the minimal facilities that would be experienced once their squadrons deployed overseas. The base originally consisted of 21 barracks for enlisted personnel, 4 junior BOQs, bachelor officer quarters, 1 senior BOQ for senior officers, a recreational building, a dispensary, and a laundry, 2 bay hangars, a boathouse, and miscellaneous buildings for heads and showers, and for radio, radar, and navigation training aids. I was one of the enlisted personnel, a teenager from a fairly protected background in the Washington, D.C. area, who had never ventured far from home. I had been as far north as Maine, south to Virginia, and west to western Maryland, until enlisting at 17. After a little over a year in the Navy, I was a seaman first class, striking apprenticing for an aviation machinist mate rating. My feelings were euphoric that afternoon in March 1944, as I was now really in a squadron. The announcement had just come through. I had no experience in airplanes, let alone PBMs, and I was awed by the size and appearance of these huge seaplanes sitting on the ramps on their beaching gear. I stood looking at them that day thinking that no airplane could look as ungainly as these PBMs on land. They were not unlike big, pregnant birds. I was both excited and apprehensive, but had always wanted to fly, so I couldn't wait to get on with the training. In 1943, I had attended both aviation machinist mate and radar schools in Jacksonville, Florida, and aerial gunnery school at Yellowwater, Florida. I realized, however, that I still had much to learn and that this was the real world. For just a moment, I felt myself as part of the many others who must have stood there before me, who probably had felt much as I did that day. My assignment, it seemed to me, had been hard won. After a brief assignment to the crash crew, who were available at crash scenes to do whatever needed to be done, this was at the Naval Air Station at Oceana, Virginia, a good learning experience. I had arrived at Harvey Point late in January, where I had been assigned to the Master at Arms, the police chief of the base, a sadistic chief bosun's mate named Hayes. I had been made a brig guard and was responsible for prisoners whenever they were out of lockup. I would escort them with my .45 caliber automatic strapped to my hip and think about my succinct orders from the chief. If a prisoner tries to escape, you stop them, shooting if you have to. The penalty if you shoot is the cost of the bullet you fire. If you're stupid enough to allow a prisoner to escape, the penalty is that you serve the remainder of his sentence. Collateral duties had been checking barracks for cleanliness and also serving as the reveille announcer, going from barracks to barracks and rousing the flight crews. I had never had so many objects thrown at me or been called so many unusual names. I couldn't wait to meet my assigned squadron, VP 21. The air crews. The squadron is to be comprised of 15 individual air crews, usually made up of 13 to 14 members. Our air crew, Crew 14, had 14 members, 4 officers, a patrol plane commander, a first pilot, and 2 other pilots who served as navigator and relief pilot. The 10-man enlisted crew was comprised of a plane captain plus 4 other aviation machinist mates, 3 aviation radiomen, and 2 aviation ordnancemen. Crewmen were cross-trained in many functions: radar, seamanship duties, and gunnery. We machinist mates learned the duties of flight engineer. This fascinated me because the flight engineer was really in control of the plane from a mechanical standpoint. He tended all the engine controls, fuel system, electrical systems, etc. The pilots flew the plane, but the flight engineer provided the support. I found that operating the radar was difficult for me, even though I'd been to radar operator school. I was not very proficient. Fortunately, we had a radioman, Charles Ray, in the crew, whom we could count on when we needed some expertise. This was a time of learning, not only about each other, but about the plane and all the duties we would be responsible for. We also tried to learn as much as possible about the other guy's job. Trust and dependency are what make air crews efficient, getting to know each other's strengths and weaknesses. Our crew would become like family, as we ate with them, bunked with them, and shared our life before the Navy with them. A crew with 14 members has 14 personalities, but always one goal in mind: to do the best job possible and survive and get back home. There will be many instances spelled out in this narrative of individuals putting themselves on the line for the good of their crew. I have a pet theory that no one is born a hero. A person becomes a hero when he does what he thinks is right for others, without hesitation. It is really a question of circumstances. I don't believe heroes have time to react to a situation with fear or terror because they're too busy acting on the situation. Each crew soon becomes a reflection of its PPC and that PPC's style of leadership. Discipline and self-confidence brought about high morale in the air crews of Squadron VP-21 and the belief that we could accomplish whatever needed to be done. There were crises in every crew at times, but usually they were resolved by either a change of personnel to another crew or in some instances by grounding the individual and assigning him other duties. Most reassignment of personnel was because of incompatibility, but sometimes it was due to incompetence. I recall when we were undergoing anti-submarine training at Key West, Florida, one of our crew's radiomen failed to secure the hatch in the tail tunnel, his pre-flight responsibility. As we taxied out for takeoff, we took on quite a bit of water. Fortunately, not enough to cause a serious problem, but enough to be a real concern. He was gone the next day. Camaraderie. Friends were made quickly in the service. Each crew evolved as its personalities and skills became sorted out. For us, this occurred during our 3 months training at Harvey Point, so the squadron is pretty well solidified as far as crew organization when we left for the West Coast in June '44. At that time, there were 59 officers and 166 enlisted men on board. Most of the officers, as well as the enlisted men, were good guys, friendly and easygoing. The camaraderie developed primarily because we all shared the same hazards of flying and discomforts of shipboard life and living at the buoy night after night when overseas. Almost without exception, the pilots were good, as naval aviators tended to be and as seaplane pilots had to be. I truly believe that most of us, if we really thought about it, had a comfort, a confidence, and a security about our pilots. Handling a 28-ton plane in the air was enough of a challenge, but the planes also had to be handled on the water, which was an art unto itself. We were truly sailor aviators. The sailor aviators. Before I get into the actual flying and day-to-day activities in this chronicle, I want to further define my term sailor aviator. I mentioned in the preface my admiration for the pilots of flute seaplanes. They were skilled beyond the usual piloting skills. Seaplane runways are always in motion, at times in violent motion. Swells rolling at about 15 to 20 degrees out of a 15 to 20 knot chop meant at times that the plane would disappear in trousers and made a takeoff run. Taking off in a seaplane, then, is a different experience than taking off in a land plane. I think one of the best descriptions I've ever heard was one given by Bob Smith, a pilot in VPB 216 and later VPB 21. This description is from an article by Bob in Wings magazine, August 1990. At Saipan, I had the buoy watch, and about dawn on June 25, 1944, a rearming boat came alongside, bouncing in the waves and swells, to very carefully let the rest of the crew climb aboard, all of whom were drenched from the choppy ride from the tender. Lieutenant J.G. Denny Roberts and Lieutenant J.G. Sparky Sparks soon had the engines ready for takeoff. We had a full bomb load of nearly 5,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, and of course every gallon of gasoline the tanks would hold, 2,140 gallons. We grossed 56,000 pounds. Large swells were rolling about 18 to 20 degrees out of the 15 to 20 knot chop. I recalled seeing the other four mariners almost disappear in the troughs as they made takeoff runs. I weighed 140 pounds and was 24 years old. Both PPCs were smaller men in stature, 2 years older, but they instantly became big men on the large yoke as they applied 48 inches of manifold pressure, using the full high-pitched 2,800 RPMs of the large four-bladed props. 70 seconds later, we seemed to get on the step, and the PPCs courageously went slightly crosswind to ride the swells. They finally, but not quickly, got us airborne. None of this description's exaggeration was typical of most takeoffs, including a few at night. On occasion, when the water was particularly rough, as VPB-26 found when operating at Iwo Jima, pilots might request large ships to execute turns in the Seadrome area, thereby smoothing the water enough to allow a landing. So air crews really had to be sailors as well as aviators, because handling the plane on the water was not easy. In the Pacific particularly, it was always complicated by wind, coral reefs, and other obstacles. Slow-speed turns while taxiing on the water were often accomplished by flipping the engines on and off, always hoping they would catch before completely stopping, and by use of sea anchors. Making the buoy required real water handling skills, whether for parking at a buoy or for preparing for a trip onto the ramp ashore, where the plane became more like a 28-ton boat. Another example of the skills required when taxiing and taking off in the PBM is that you had to learn the trim angle that gave the greatest acceleration and made for the easiest control. If the nose was held too high, takeoff performance was impaired, not only because of higher water resistance, but also because of solid water from the first step hitting the afterbody and sucking the tail of the plane down. This would usually cause the plane to break clear of the water prematurely. With the nose held too low during the takeoff run, water resistance was again increased and the nose would exhibit a tendency to suck down, causing a bad porpoising action. Porpoising, a plunging up and down movement, can be disastrous as it tends to perpetuate itself if not quickly controlled. I'm sure there are many more examples of the skills required of these pilots, and they were truly a unique breed. That's why I entitled them Sailor Aviators. Air crewmen also had to develop seamanship skills, and thus also were Sailor Aviators. Flying begins. Our squadron's first three planes, new PBM-3Ds, were delivered the last week of March. Our planes would be designated by crew number and by our squadron call sign, Victor. Victor 1, Victor 2, Victor 3, etc. was noted by a large V on the forward fuselage with the number in the V. As soon as the PPCs received familiarization flights in the area, we commenced syllabus training flights, using the three planes we started with. Almost a month later, we had 12 planes, but the full complement of 15 planes was not reached until a few days before we deployed to the West Coast for overseas duty. In the interim, we flew planes borrowed from other squadrons in residence at Harvey Point. Our plane, the PBM Mariner. So much of the story revolves around the plane that I thought it appropriate to provide a detailed description of the plane we flew, the PBM Mariner. This should make what follows in the story more understandable to the reader. As already noted, the PBM was one of the least known airplanes of World War II. A patrol bomber, it was built by the Glenn L. Martin Company in Baltimore, Maryland. The Mariner resulted from a contract issued by the Navy to the Glenn L. Martin Company in 1937 for a twin-engine, all-metal, deep-hold flying boat. The initial test flight of the XPBM-1 took place on February 18, 1939. On September 7, 1939, the first operational model, the PBM-1, was operating with VP-55 and VP-56 out of the Naval Air Station at Norfolk, Virginia. The rest is history, and part of that history is told on these pages. The PBM was a real workhorse, serving in all theaters of the war, the Caribbean, the North and South Atlantic, and the Pacific. Prior to Pearl Harbor, they were in service providing an anti-submarine warfare, ASW, capability in the Atlantic. When the war officially started for the U.S., they became a mainstay in fighting U-boats in the Atlantic and Caribbean. PBM-1's 3 Cs and 3 S's had sunk 10 U-boats by the fall of '43. There were 16 PBM-3S squadrons operating in the Atlantic when the first PBM-3D squadron arrived in the Pacific in January '44. The PBM, like most military planes, was built for efficiency in performing the basic assigned task and not for the comfort of the crew. The plane was not pretty and looked rather ungainly with its gull wings and deep fuselage and its tail compartment sloping upward to a double rudder tail. The description that follows is based on information in an August 1944 edition of the Pilot's Handbook of Flight Operating Instructions. It was a big plane with a wingspan of 118 feet and a length of 79 feet. The PBM-3D VP-21's plane for the first 12 months of its existence was powered by twin Curtiss-Wright R2600-22 engines, rated at 1,900 horsepower, driving 4-bladed propellers. The PBM-5, which replaced the 3D, was equipped with better engines, the Pratt & Whitney R2800-22, rated at 2,100 horsepower. Maximum speed was about 215 miles per hour, with a service ceiling of approximately 20,000 feet. Fuel capacity with droppable bomb bay tanks was 3,496 gallons, and range was in the 2,300 to 2,400 miles. Maximum weight was about 58,000 pounds. Armament consisted of 8 50 caliber type M-2 machine guns, 2 each in the bow, deck, and tail turrets, and 1 mounted at each of the 2 waist hatches. The turrets are all electro-hydraulic, controlled with Mark 8 electric gun sights. The waist guns, usually 50 caliber M2s, had hydraulic controls or could be used manually. This armament was supplemented later by 2 30 caliber machine guns, 1 in each of the bow hatches. A bomb load of 4,000 pounds, bombs, depth charges, or mines, was carried in the bomb bays located at the aft end of the engine nacelles. Also, 2 Mark 13 torpedoes could be carried, 1 under each wing, between the hull and an engine nacelle. This completed the armament. The fuselage of the plane was divided into 5 watertight compartments by bulkheads provided with watertight doors. First, the bow compartment contained the bow turret and the bombardier station. After the bow compartment, to about 3 feet forward of the leading edge of the wing, the fuselage divided into 2 floor levels. The upper floor was the flight deck, which contained the raised pilot's control station at the forward end, with a seat for the pilot on the left and for the co-pilot on the right, a navigator's station on the left behind the pilot, a seat between the pilot and navigator for the radar operator, a radio operator station on the right behind the co-pilot, and the flight engineer station at the aft end of the flight deck. The lower level was the galley compartment, with refrigerator and electric range. Directly aft was the fuel compartment and the lavatory. Beneath the center wing structure were 2 small compartments. The forward one was the bunk room, and the aft held a fuel tank, the saddle tank. Above that was the auxiliary power unit on what was called the putt-putt deck. This unit supplied power for the plane when the engines weren't running. The navigator's hatch was also on that deck. After that was the after hull compartment, containing the waist gunner stations and the deck turret. A tunnel from the aft hull compartment provided access to the tail compartment, which contained the tail turret. A passageway extended from the bulkhead under the front spar down through the center of the plane and back to the tail turret. Forward of the front spar, the passageway extended down the left side of the plane to the galley compartment. A flight of stairs led to a door on the right, which opened on the flight deck just forward of the flight engineer's station. 2 manholes in the bottom wing skin in the fuel compartment allowed access to the center wing section and the bomb bays. Personnel protection against gunfire consisted of 2 pieces of armor plate behind the pilot's and co-pilot's seats, 6 pieces of armor plate for protection of crew members on the flight deck, 1 piece of armor plate on the aft section of each waist hatch door for protection of the waist gunners, and face and body armor plate for the protection of each turret gunner. Patrols in the model we originally flew, the PBM-3D, were made a bit hairier by the rather unreliable Curtiss-Wright engines. I always felt that many of us had a love-hate relationship with the PBMs. In the over 1,000 hours I flew in various models, the PBM-3S, the PBM-3D, and the PBM-5, I can recall experiencing just about every type of possible problem, from engine failure to fire. But I survived it all, so I guess there's really more love than hate. For a military plane, though, the PBM was fairly comfortable. There was room to walk around, and most crew members felt squeezed only in one of the turrets. The PBM in various modifications served the Navy until 1956, so it was a tough and durable old bird. My first flight. Everyone remembers his first airplane flight, and I'm no exception. I had met two of our pilots, Ensign Walter Melmeyer and Paul Casey, and the enlisted crew members during Everyone remembers his first airplane flight, and I am no exception. I had met two of our pilots, Ensigns Walter Melmeyer and Paul Casey, and the enlisted crew members during various ground training sessions. Now I met the other two pilots, Lieutenant Leo Early, patrol plane commander, and Lieutenant J.G. Joe Durda, first pilot, as we waited at the boathouse next to seaplane ramp for transport to a plane secured to a buoy in the river. Leo Early said to me when I was introduced, nice to have you on board. I was told you'd never flown, right? I responded in my most sincere manner, yes, sir, but I'm looking forward to learning whatever I need to know. He responded, fine, now let's get with it and prove to us you're good enough to belong. It was my first insight to Leo as a no-nonsense naval officer. Leo was a 29-year-old from Virginia. He had been in both a PBY squadron and a PBM squadron prior to joining VP-21. He was a good pilot, but pretty much a by-the-book naval officer. As long as you did your job, he was okay, but don't screw up. After the war, he stayed in the Navy and retired a captain. I correspond with him now at his home in Virginia, but he's 80, 1995. He has mellowed a bit, as we all do with age. Joe Durda, a 25-year-old, was from Minnesota, a great guy, now deceased. He had played football, quarterback at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He always treated us as equals while providing real leadership. He was in the Navy for a number of years, including the Korean War, and then went home to Minnesota and founded Aeration Industries, a very successful pollution control equipment company. Ensign Walter Melmeyer, a 22-year-old pilot and navigator, was always a friend, and to this day we are close. Melmeyer was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and now has his own company in Beaver, Pennsylvania. The fourth officer, also a pilot and navigator, was Ensign Paul Casey. He was in the insurance business, now deceased. Paul was a nice young guy, 25 years old, from Kentucky. Unfortunately, he was not one of Leo's favorites and often bore the brunt of his criticism, particularly when navigating. One of the enlisted members of the crew was Vince Volpe, senior aviation machinist mate and plane captain, the granddaddy of the crew at about 30 years of age. Vince was from Pennsylvania, a nice guy who I still see on occasion. He was a great teacher. He gave me my first exposure to flight engineer duties. After the Navy, Vince served for years on ships plying the rivers of the Midwest as an engineer. Then there was Bob Garrison, now deceased, from Washington State, also an aviation machinist mate. He was a funny guy, always seemed to be disorganized. Always thought he was a small-time kleptomaniac and a little out of it at times. But he got the job done. Bill Hines and Frank Thompson and me, now 18, rounded out the machinist mate cadre of the crew. Hines was from a tough neighborhood in New Jersey and was a consummate bitcher, full of sarcasm. He talked continually about his girlfriend in Memphis and how all he wanted to do was get out of the Navy. Thompson, now deceased, was an easygoing young guy from Fall River, Massachusetts. He was not a happy camper, not awfully gung-ho about the Navy, but did his job. After he got out of the Navy, he became a policeman in Fall River. One radioman was Harry Gardner, now deceased, the senior of our three radiomen. He was from Texas, I believe, and we made several abortive attempts to get together after the war, but never connected. He'd been around the track, having served in Panama and the Caribbean, was a good radioman and took an occasional drink. Then there was Charles Ray from Alabama, the southern gentleman of the crew and quite the ladies' man. We remained close and talked often. He retired after a career in the financial world and now lives in Florida. A third radioman was John Looney from Oswego, New York. He worked for a number of years for RCA and now lives in southern New Jersey. We flew with two ordnancemen. Frank Reddy, now deceased, was a nice, quiet guy, but not too swift. Leo eventually got rid of him via transfer. Last but not least was Richard R. Sykowski, now deceased, from Brooklyn, New York. Dick had never been to Times Square, nor seen a real live cow until he joined the Navy. He was as naive a person as I ever met, a little slow in the uptake, but very loyal and worked at his job. Interestingly, as diverse as the group was, we worked well as a crew and responded to crises well. We could be very critical of each other, but it was always within the confines of the crew. When we finally arrived at the plane, I remember trying to absorb all the pre-flight routine. Also, I was trying to adjust to the pervasive odor procured in military planes, particularly seaplanes, a combination of gasoline, exhaust, hydraulic fluid, oil, cigarette smoke, body odor, bilges, and the metallic smell of the plane itself. I felt a rush of adrenaline as we prepared for takeoff. I think I always did and do even to this day after hundreds of flights. Takeoff was an experience. You'd go a long way on the water, bouncing around and splashing a lot. It was noisy. The water beating against the hull at times would be deafening, since there was no soundproofing except on the flight deck. The smoother the water, the longer the takeoff run. You have to break the suction of the water, and it's easier to a degree when you have rough water to help get the plane on the step and airborne. But you can't coddle the plane because you run the risk of porpoising, which is always dangerous, and the plane can get out of control quickly. Anyway, when the engines started, they coughed, sputtered, and then the cylinders fired, sending clouds of blue smoke and an occasional burst of flame from the exhaust stacks until they caught and began their distinctive sound. After the flight engineer and pilot went through their checklist and the ordnanceman in the bow loosed us from the buoy, we began to taxi forward with the motion of a boat nosing into the waves. We then turned into the wind and started the takeoff run. After what I thought was a lifetime of bouncing around, we were finally airborne. I was hit with an immediate feeling of nausea. Fortunately, Harry Gardner was standing near me after takeoff and commented, "You look a little green around the gills. Try this old remedy of mine." Then he proffered some juicy fruit chewing gum, which settled my stomach. To this day, I suggest it to queasy air travelers. We flew for about 2.5 hours, and I found it fascinating. I was amazed at how fast I learned some of the routine. Vince Volpe, our seasoned plane captain, had told me, "Put on the earphones, listen to the intercom the whole flight, and you'll learn a lot." I did and quickly began picking up some of the lingo. The Navy had its own vocabulary: head for toilet, bulkhead for wall, scuttlebutt for drinking fountain, gee-dunk for ice cream, etc., etc. And then there were the specific seaplane idioms: on the step, making the buoy, porpoising, etc. I also learned some of the basic seamanship skills, like the use of sea anchors and beaching gear. Sea anchors, one for each side of the plane, were made of canvas material shaped into a cone and attached to a metal ring about 3 feet in diameter, with a 6 to 10 foot line attached for deploying and then tripping when no longer needed. They were our brakes. As we taxied to the ramp when making the buoy, one could be deployed from the port or starboard waist hatch as needed. And they were our brakes as we taxied to the ramp or when making the buoy. One could be deployed from the port or starboard waist hatch as needed to slow the plane and assist in steering. Communication between the pilots and crewmen handling these was critical, as real seamanship skills were needed to control the plane, particularly in rough water. After we landed and left the plane, we made decisions about battle stations. I volunteered for the tail turret, Bill Hines the deck turret, Frank Reddy and Dick Sykowski shared the bow turret, and the waist gunners would be John Looney and Frank Thompson. With these assignments, we assumed responsibility for the maintenance of the guns, cleaning, bore sighting, and general maintenance of our turrets. With these assignments, we assumed responsibility for the maintenance of the guns, cleaning, bore sighting, and general maintenance of our turrets. As explained earlier, the turrets were Martin power turrets, each with twin 50 caliber M2 Browning aircraft machine guns. They were hydraulic, self-contained units and could be operated manually if power was lost. The firepower of these 8 guns was awesome. When all were firing, the whole plane vibrated. On the beach, the PBM had no wheeled landing gear, so portable beaching gear was utilized. This consisted of 2 sets of tandem wheels for main gear and a smaller set for the rear of the plane. each with flotation gear that facilitated getting it from the ramp to the plane by members of the beaching crew. When attached to the hull by one of us from the beaching gear hatches, then the plane could be towed out onto the ramp by a tractor. When ready to leave the ramp, the plane would enter the water by attaching a tractor to the rear of the plane and then slowly taxiing down the ramp, being braked by the tractor. Then it went into the water where the beaching gear is released and pulled ashore, then we taxied away. A beaching crew usually consisted of a beachmaster, 2 to 4 side wheel men, and at least one man who brought the tail wheel out to the plane. This was a thankless but necessary and often difficult job, which had to be done regardless of the weather. Often it was assigned to you if you fouled up, a form of punishment. I remember during cold weather at Harvey Point, the beaching crew often emerged from the water with a film of ice sliding down their wetsuits and icicles hanging from their noses. The art of making the buoy. Lieutenant Charles Atkinson, PPC of Crew 3, authored an interesting, albeit tongue-in-cheek, quite realistic dissertation in 1944 called The Art of Buoy Making. This is obviously a lost art in the seaplane-less Navy of today, but a very real part of our lives back then. Atkinson wrote the following: "This is not intended to make an expert buoy maker out of the reader, but it is a treatise on recognizing the problems of buoy making and of coping with them sanely. All you have to do is taxi your plane up to an object and tie your bow line to it. It is this sheer simplicity that pulls the wool over one's eyes. Naval Air Station Key West affords us a revolting example of how the elements can team up against a pilot in quest of a buoy and send him off, calling his plane vulgar names like Blowbird and threatening to turn in his water wings. At that coral reef, people once made their living by causing ships to run aground and then looting the derelicts, but the law stopped that. However, there have been more seaplanes run aground since the law than ships previous to it. The current, always opposite the direction indicated by the sign on the beach, placed there by the Key Westerners, is invariably against the wind. If you head into the wind, the current will send you sailing past the buoy on the step. If you head into the current, the wind will send you past it likewise. In such a case, it is obvious that the desired condition is to have a fast and brave bowman. He might lose an arm trying, but after all, he gets sea pay. The obvious problem is to be at the buoy going slowly enough for the bowman to pick up the buoy and make it fast to the plane's snubbing post with the bow line. To some bowmen, this means come to a full stop and stay there while he finds a line in the after station and brings it forward. When in good humor, we call this type of bowman butterfingers. But if you have a butterfingers, it's advisable to send him up in the wing during the buoy making. That will get him out of the way. He might even fall off and drown. After the bowman takes at least 2 half hitches around the snubbing post, it's time to yell, "Cut 'em." When the flight engineer has replied, "Both engines in idle cutoff, sir," you may, if you like, and most pilots do like, shove both the throttles wide open. This gives you the mission accomplished feeling, but it may send you away from the buoy and leave part of your plane there too. Of course, there are several theories on what to do if you miss the buoy. The one we encourage the least is covering the eyes and saying the Lord's Prayer. This usually ends in disaster, even for those who go to church every Sunday. If it looks as if the odds against getting away without a hole are total disintegration of the plane, cut the engines and drop the hook, the anchor, not the buoy hook. Then say the Lord's Prayer while the crew closes all the watertight doors and breaks out the bilge pump. If the plane stops before you hit anything, your worries about making the buoy are over. Engines, oh those engines. Our squadron's shakedown was hampered by many factors, including slow delivery of aircraft, limited overhaul and repair facilities, mechanical difficulties involving a change of cylinders in all planes, and lack of knowledge of future operating requirements and how to best prepare for them. On the whole, the PBM-3D was a rugged plane, but the Curtiss-Wright R2600-22 engines were a continual problem. The cylinders were the problem, were changed on all of our planes, but the problem wasn't easily solved, and before we left for overseas, we received new planes in exchange for our old ones. The new planes had a new type of engine cylinder with factory pinned-in exhaust valve seats, supposedly an improvement over the old type. However, the cylinder problem never really got solved and continued to cause problems, so it was relieved when in March of '45 at Saipan, we got replacement planes. PBM-5s with a much more reliable Pratt & Whitney R-28 engines. I've spoken of and will continue to speak of my admiration for seaplane pilots, who I think are a unique breed. One of the many I respect, because he epitomized my sailor aviator definition, was Lieutenant Forrest Frosty Moore. He told me a story about the engines and a friend of his, Lieutenant Commander Frank Lynch, who was one of the original naval aviators. Lynch was commanding officer of Hedron 5-1, which is the headquarters squadron at Harvey Point, where Moore was assigned. Lynch and his maintenance crew decided to check the valves on all the Curtiss Wright R-2600 engines. They had constant trouble with them, and Lynch's maintenance officer said, "Let's check the valves on the good engines." They pulled the stacks and found 54 exhaust valves. They pulled the stacks and found 54 exhaust valve seats loose or about to fall out. This resulted in the grounding of all the PBMs in the Atlantic Fleet. At about this time, Moore entered the picture. Lynch was pushing hard to get new valves in all the planes. However, Lieutenant Commander Robertson, who was CO of the Air Wing at Harvey Point, had a disagreement with Lynch about the valves. This ended up becoming an altercation between Lynch, who was in his 60s, and Robertson in his 30s, near the officers' club one evening, about who was in charge of the engines. Lynch decked Robertson with one punch. Lynch had been a middleweight boxer at the Naval Academy. Anyway, Lynch then ordered me to take out the first plane to test the new valves. I took off before daylight, April 17, 1944, to avoid a run-in with Robertson. Lynch had told me not to respond to any message to return to base, and he would say I had no trouble with Robertson. At about 8:30, I began receiving orders to return to base. I told my radio man to screw up his system in some way so that we'd have a reason for not getting a message or responding. We landed about 12:30 after a 4.5-hour engine test. We never heard anything from Robertson and actually tested 5 more planes. Shortly afterwards, I transferred to VP-21, where my good friend Norm Lorenzen was assigned. Flying begins in earnest. Initially, we had a fair bit of non-flying weather, but then we flew often, day and night. We were always busy. I was trying to learn so much, and often to the chagrin of some of my crew, I asked lots of questions. In spite of all the adversities faced, however, the squadron completed the whole training syllabus as set down by Fleet Air Wing 5. In fact, we completed 121% of the syllabus, 2,346 flight hours, some 156 hours per crew by June. I felt like a real veteran airman at that point. We flew lots of navigation hops and bounce or touch-and-go hops. They were practice landing and takeoffs where you take off, circle in a traffic pattern, then touch down in the water and take off again. You might do this for a couple of hours or so, up and down, rather boring except for the pilots and flight engineer. Formation flying was practiced, although seldom employed except when overseas and in transit from one location to another. On these training flights, Leo Early, our PPC, used to say, "None of those other guys know how to fly, boys, so put your chutes on. You look out, stay on the ball. If you get any closer than you are now, let me know immediately." We practiced single engine operation, shutting down one or the other. This came in handy when we coped with the problem twice in the Pacific. The squadron had more than its share of these mishaps, with at least 5 planes going down as a result. This occurred despite the fact that the operating manual said the PBM would fly on one engine. Oh, okay, I lost my thought. Like many instruction manuals, things only work well if conditions are right. Unfortunately, in emergencies, they seldom are. We practiced bombing runs using 100-pound water-filled bombs. I was party to a near disaster one Sunday on a practice bombing mission out in Albemarle Sound. I, for some reason, was on the bomb site, and with my limited knowledge of what I was doing, dropped a stick of bombs in some nice family's backyard, as they were probably enjoying their Sunday dinner. From the flight deck, Leo Early made some comment about my intelligence and my technical skills, but I recalled after this incident that I wasn't the only one to miss. A number of friends of mine who flew bombers over Europe often joked about their Norden bomb site's inability to put a bomb in a pickle barrel from 10,000 feet. They said, "We probably destroyed more fields of corn, wheat, and potatoes than enemy installations." We also flew air-to-air gunnery flights, firing at cloth-sleeve targets towed by planes from the Marine Air Station at Edenton, North Carolina. For these flights, we used color-coded ammunition. The bullets would be dipped in paint to identify the particular gunner. When they penetrated the sleeve, most of the paint would come off to signify a hit. As gunners, most of the time, we belted our own ammunition using hand or automatic belters to shove the cartridge into the connecting metal links of the belt. Ammunition was generally belted with a combination of bullets: armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer, and ball. For sleeve targets, we used tracer and plain ball. Gunners were also responsible for cleaning their guns after every firing and for bore sighting occasionally to ensure their accuracy. Then we flew camera gunnery hops, shooting film rather than bullets. These were always interesting, and crews quickly learned to coordinate communication with each other using the clock as reference. For example, a plane attacking directly head-on was at 12 o'clock. One directly at starboard was 3 o'clock. One directly behind was at 6 o'clock, and so on around the dial. You also noted whether it was high or low at the position you called. On these flights, we worked with fighter planes from nearby naval air stations. Most of us found it a little scary the first couple of times a fighter rolled over and made an attack on us at over 300 miles an hour. I always felt that some of those hotshot fighter pilots liked to see how close they could come in making a pass. I swore one day that an F-4F Wildcat fighter flashed by with his wingtips between our wing and tail structure. In addition, we flew level strafing flights using targets in Pamlico Sound. Frank Brim of Crew 11 learned a communication lesson on one of his first flights out of Harvey Point. Riding in the tail turret, he noticed 3 fighter planes off to his left and above, and so notified his pilot, Rex Rader. Rex asked, "Where are they exactly?" Brim replied, "Right there." "Where?" Rex asked. Brim replied again, "Right there." When they landed, Rex gave Brim a specific lesson in communicating the location of targets. Not right there, but rather 5 o'clock high, 3 o'clock low, or whatever's appropriate. Use the hands of the clock as your reference, he said. Rader then wanted to know if Frank had slept through aerial gunnery school. For diversion, we occasionally flew up the myriad of creeks and inlets so common to the North Carolina coastal areas at a 40 to 50-foot altitude, and probably scared many a fisherman. Also, when the opportunity presented itself, we would buzz a beach and wave to young ladies sunning themselves. Is it all right so far?
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Out of the country, Bermuda's sojourn. Navigation training flights took us first to Bermuda. This would be an initial extended flight for a lot of us and a forerunner of things to come. This was my first trip ever out of the country, and I found Bermuda to be very beautiful. The only automobiles allowed on the island in those days were military, so it was all the more idyllic. I've been back since on vacation and find it still has an innate charm and beauty. Unfortunately, many of the invasion forces going to North Africa and the Mediterranean had also been through Bermuda, causing lots of problems. As a result, sailors were at the bottom of the social pecking order. We couldn't get served at certain hotels and restaurants, and no woman would be seen with us. We enjoyed the place anyway, and Harry Gardner discovered a malfunction in our radio equipment that extended our stay an extra day while a part was flown out from Harvey Point. It seems in a private conversation one of the pilots suggested, "Harry, could you arrange a discrepancy in our communication system for a bottle of good scotch?" Harry willingly complied, and we all enjoyed the respite. We toured the island, sightseeing a good part of one day, found a place to eat, had a couple of beers before heading back to the seaplane base. Paul Kingston related a story about Crew 2's return trip from Bermuda. When we left Bermuda to return home, we popped a cylinder, feathered the propeller, got the plane turned around, and tossing everything movable overboard, made it back to the seaplane base of Bermuda. The pilot complained of stiff controls, but when we landed, it turned out he was flying with the automatic pilot on. Not a big confidence builder. After getting the plane on the ramp, the crew immediately went ashore, bought a couple of bottles, rented 2 horse-drawn carriages, and took off for a tour of the island. Key West, Florida, anti-submarine training. Key West, Florida was a night navigation training flight lasting about 6.5 to 7 hours. This tied into a 9-day anti-submarine training exercise. When the squadron first arrived, there was a message from the commanding officer of Harvey Point to the commanding officer of the air station at Key West to the effect, it is requested that all enlisted personnel of Squadron VP-21 be restricted to barracks during their off-duty hours while in your command. They are responsible for destruction of government property. Seemed a few of the guys had torn apart of a barracks after a few beers one night. Due to the good auspices of our skipper, Ned Dougherty, we were not deprived of our liberty passes while completing the 9-day course. The training had us working with Navy submarines, actually World War I vintage R-class subs, practicing search and destroy tactics. It was sort of fun trying to find them and attacking before they submerged in the Florida Straits. We'd play the game for several hours at a time, spotting them on the surface, then making a high-speed diving attack. I think most of us remember landing at the Key West Aerodrome, as we got lower in our approach, hundreds of barracuda and sharks in the water. None of us wanted to be a member of the beaching crew there. The air station at Key West was a nice base, and we had just about every night off to explore the town, which was remote and fairly provincial in those days. We had several all-crew social evenings on the town. We got to know the pilots a lot better over mugs of beer and plates of shrimp. I've been back there a number of times, worked there for several months in the 50s, and still like it even though it's become very touristy. Clyde Nipper of Crew 4 related a scary experience they had en route to Key West. On May 9, 1944, the squadron was deploying to Key West. Our course out of Harvey Point was almost a straight line to Key West, which had put us out over the ocean for most of the flight. We were flying in a 3-plane formation when suddenly a huge thunderhead appeared in front of us. We were at 8,000 feet at the time. Our plane, Victor 4, was on the starboard wing of the formation, and as the lead plane turned to go around the thunderhead, we turned to starboard. This put us heading right back into the cloud on its left quadrant. As we entered it, the plane began to buck and shake violently, and the wind flipped the plane over on its side, with the port wing pointing straight down. In this attitude, we began to lose altitude rather quickly. My station as radioman was behind the co-pilot's seat, and at this point both the pilot and co-pilot were fighting the controls, trying desperately to get the port wing up before we went into a spin. They got the plane under control, but this left us in a nose-down attitude. They leveled the elevators and were trying to pull the nose up to level out the dive we were in. They were both pulling back on the control wheel with all their strength, but were getting nowhere. It was obvious it just wasn't enough. At that moment, I looked out the cockpit window and saw the ocean coming up fast. I got out of my seat and asked if I could help somehow. John Moriarty told me to put my foot on the right engine control panel, my left hand on his wheel, and my right hand on the co-pilot's wheel, and pull like hell. With this added leverage, the plane began to slow its headlong rush towards the ocean, and the nose slowly came up. It was a slow process, and we continued losing altitude fast. But we kept pulling the controls with all our strength and gradually came out of our dive. At this point, I let go and looked at the altimeter. It read 1,000 feet. Fortunately, the pilots had full control now, and we climbed back to altitude and continued on to our landing at Key West. But not everyone was that lucky. Disaster strikes. There were 3 unfortunate accidents while we were in training, and with them came the first realization for some of us of our own mortality. I don't think most of us had worried about getting killed. Like most young people, we thought death was always something that happens to someone else. We obviously wanted to survive, but death wasn't a constant worry. In a few instances I was aware of, an obsession with it resulted in individuals being grounded. The first accident happened on the night of April 10th, and it was due in all probability to the inadequacy of the Cross River runway for night operations. A plane piloted by Lieutenant Dick Doyle, Lieutenant J.G. Dick Sims, and Lieutenant J.G. Arthur Gamble, all experienced pilots, overshot the runway on a Cross River landing during a touch-and-go hop and piled up on the beach about a half-mile south of the main ramp. The plane burned immediately, resulting in a total loss, but fortunately all the crew escaped with only minor injuries. It was a very lucky night for them. The second accident occurred when my crew was on an aerial gunnery hop, firing at a sleeve target being towed by a Marine plane. As the tow plane was moving in for the second run past us, a machine gun in the deck turret, manned by Bill Hines, fired, and several .50 caliber bullets hit the rear of the tow plane, where the two sleeve cable operators were working. Both men were wounded in the legs, one quite seriously. It was concluded that one of the guns had overheated and pre-fired on its own. Bill was severely reprimanded, and we all learned a lesson the hard way. The third incident was the worst, as it resulted in the deaths of 9 members of a crew. It occurred during the mid-afternoon of May 31st, when Crew 13's plane, piloted by Lieutenant McRae, and Sidney Pogue and Ensign William Day, exploded in midair. The plane was on a routine gunnery hop at an unauthorized altitude of 18,000 feet under conditions of good visibility. What caused the pilot to climb to this altitude with no oxygen equipment was never discovered. It is even more of a mystery because McRae had considerable experience in PBMs, including an overseas tour. Reports from the 5 survivors, all enlisted men, indicate that the plane stalled out, whipped over on its back, and almost immediately suffered a terrific explosion, which tore off the wings and broke the fuselage in half, just aft of the waist compartment. Pogue was credited with saving the lives of the 5 survivors through some never-to-be-understood coincidence. Just prior to the explosion, he had conducted an abandoned ship drill in the waist compartment. It was because of this exercise that the survivors were wearing their parachutes when they were suddenly blown out into the atmosphere. In addition to 3 pilots, 6 enlisted crewmen were killed: Toby, LeClaire, Natali, Westhoven, Schrade, and Sloan. The 5 survivors were Frank Burris, Vernon Bradfield, Charles Murdoch, Chester Szynski, and Maurice Veroni. They became the nucleus for a new Crew 16. There would never be another Crew 13 in our squadron. Veroni said later, "We 5 joined Crew 16 together. We wore our Mae Wests and parachute harnesses for our first 3 or 4 flights, but then felt foolish and hung them up once airborne." I remember it took about 3 months for me to get over air sickness. Every flight I upchucked, and all I could keep down was soda crackers. What a great feeling it was to eventually eat a steak with the rest of the crew. The old saying that timing is everything was never truer than it was for our Charles Ray, who was originally a member of Crew 13. On the day of this fateful crash, when he reported in for the flight, he was informed that he had been transferred to Crew 14. Another spin on this story: James Lane, who was the crash crew chief at the Naval Auxiliary Airship at Creeds, Virginia, told me of his experience with this crash. I was assigned to Creeds, an outlying airstrip used by the Oceana, Virginia Naval Air Station. It was, to my best recollection, about 14:30 hours on May 31st, 1944, when I heard an explosion and looked skyward. My first reaction was that 2 fighters had collided, but it turned out it was a PBM-3D, a VP-21, that had exploded in midair. I saw 5 parachutes drifting down and raced towards them. I came to Frank Burris first, as his chute had been torn in the explosion, and he had a quicker trip down. Frank was covered with oil and was obviously in a state of shock. The other 4 chutes came down. All were 5 enlisted crewmen. The other 6 enlisted men and 3 officers were killed in the explosion. Fortunately, none of the survivors were seriously injured, and I heard they went on to form the nucleus of a new crew. It was one of the worst crashes I ever had to deal with, and it was some time before all the dead were recovered and identified. I did establish a long friendship with Frank until he passed away. That eventually resulted in my being at the squadron's 50th anniversary in Asheville, North Carolina, at the suggestion of Frank's widow, Dorothy, who was also in attendance. Low and slow. We were not high-altitude flyers. We generally flew low and slow, and so we had a chance to see a lot. I found it fascinating to be able to see houses, roads, fields, cars, trains, and people. It is so unlike flying in a big airline jet, looking out a window and seeing nothing from 35,000 feet, as I did for 30 years after the war when I was working in the corporate world and continually traveling. I remember sights from everywhere we flew in Carolina, the vast pine forests, all owned by the big paper companies nowadays, the rivers and inlets, always the tannish brown color that I found unique to that part of the world. I remember when we took off to the east from Harvey Point in the morning, it always seemed hazy as we headed out over Albemarle Sand and the Sound and the ocean beaches. It was great to be flying, and we were all young and relatively carefree. I felt that flying low and slow was a benefit for us. The geographic area around Harvey Point was like a big airport. In the area was the Naval Air Station at Norfolk with all of its satellite fields, the Naval Air Station at Oceana, Virginia, the Marine Corps Air Station at Edenton, North Carolina, the Marine Air Complex at Cherry Point, North Carolina, and a myriad of other Navy and Army Air Force fields in Eastern Carolina and Virginia. The air lanes were crowded and without the sophisticated air traffic control systems of today. We seldom flew, however, when it was really cloudy or when the torrential rainstorms common to the coastal area of the Carolinas hit the area. Our new plane, the 1st of May, as new planes became available, we flew to the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia, and picked up one of them. Later on, when at Kwajalein Island for repairs, a local Army artist adorned her with a buxom, nude brunette and the name Charlotte the Harlot. That's another story. We flew the plane, Bureau number 45362, until a fateful night in the Palau Islands when it went down. In the Navy, as a general rule, each crew had their own plane, which only they flew, except in an emergency or when the plane was down for repairs or maintenance. The crew would then be assigned another crew's plane to schedule for a flight. Combat Aircrew Wings. After so many hours of flight time, we were awarded our Combat Aircrew Wings, which were a real sign of belonging. Also, we were now drawing flight skins, dollars paid for flight service, which was a 50% increase of base pay. My base was $66 per month, so this extra $33 was a welcome increase. When we got overseas, there was both an additional hazardous duty increment of a certain number of skins per month and another add-on amount for sea duty. I don't recall the amounts, but it probably totaled another $30 a month. Life on the base. Overall, I would say that Harvey Point was like most auxiliary naval air stations. They were generally rural, remote, and hot. Usually not much in the way of social or recreational activities was available. But that might have been a boon to the vigorous training programs for any squadron preparing to deploy overseas. For lack of anything else to do, we got our sleep. Like all air stations, there was almost incessant rumble of engines on the ramp, day and night, as planes undergoing maintenance or run up for testing. Plus, the constant noise of takeoffs and landings was loud. But one got used to it, fortunately, so it didn't seem too disruptive after a while. Again, as I reflect back, we enlisted personnel were all really the same wherever we were. We all wore the same clothes. Everyone had the same amount of space, a bunk and a locker. There was no privacy, particularly on a ship where you bunk with 50 or 100 other people and where you might sit with a dozen others in a row on the toilets. Crew 14 was housed in the same barracks with a number of other VP-21 crews. The building was rather primitive, heated with a coal stove, which wasn't too efficient in the cold weather. Fortunately, North Carolina didn't get a lot of cold weather, but when it did, it always seemed worse in those cold barracks. As a form of punishment, wayward personnel would be assigned to stoker duty. Stokers were to keep the stoves fueled up and heating properly. During the day, it was usually bearable, but at night after about 2300, the stokers usually found an empty bunk and slept till reveille. Then he would hop up and fire up the stove, hoping no one saw them. So from 0100 till about 0600, it would be freezing in the barracks. The head and showers were in a separate building, and there were times when it got so cold that some pretty ripe-smelling bodies were around. Also the dust. It seemed that the deck was always covered, and when it was swept, a lot of the dirt settled on our bunks. The officer quarters were maybe a small step above the enlisted barracks in terms of comfort, but were not luxurious by any stretch of the imagination. There was always activity in the barracks in the evenings, card games and bull sessions. There was a ship's service where we could buy cigarettes, candy, cokes, beer, and toilet articles. Several times a week, they also showed movies. There weren't a lot of exciting towns nearby, Hertford, Elizabeth City, and Edenton, none of which offered much in the way of nightlife. Despite this, some of the more aggressive Romeos did develop some relationships with females. Barracks conversations were always interesting. A conversation after lights out might go as follows. I didn't get a letter from her today. She must be out with some 4F bastard. Then some ribald remarks followed by what sexual activity she was probably involved in. The veterans of the South Atlantic, Panama, and Caribbean were always regaling us with stories of the women in that part of the world, most of whom, from the stories related, Had to have been nymphomaniacs. We always heard about Dear John letters when a girl at home dumped a guy for someone else more available. We also talked about family, other friends in service, our last leave, and the next one. Mail was the critical tie to home and girlfriends or wives. Overall, delivery was pretty prompt and continued to be timely until we went overseas. Most conversations were late with obscenities. It seemed that some were carried on using only four-letter words. Profanity was truly an art form in the Navy. I remember when we were relieved in 45 to come home, we set up a kitty of fines for using a four-letter word. We were concerned we might get home and say at the dinner table, "Would you pass the goddamn butter?" I had some good friends in other crews, and we did socialize quite a bit before we went overseas. It was interesting to get insights into how the other crews related and the different discipline and routines that existed. We all talked about the same things all young guys talk about: food, drink, sex, cars, and home. Most of the sex talk was wishful thinking, but you had to put up a worldly front. It soon became apparent, however, that most of our contact was to be with our own crew members, because most of the time was spent in their company. Although we might know a number of other squadron personnel, our world revolved around our crew. This became even truer when we were overseas and spent half of our non-flying time on buoy watch in some harbor or anchorage. We might talk among ourselves about flying and things that happened, but it was usually not shared with other crews unless there was a crash or other accident. I liked all the members of my crew, and we seemed to be a compatible group after some of the usual sorting out. There were no really major conflicts that I remember, even with the closeness of the relationship. The only married members were three of the pilots, as I recall. We did socialize as a crew, occasionally with the officers, and there was a real feeling of togetherness. This was highly unusual for the Navy, inasmuch as it had the strongest caste system of any of the services. But I always felt that the camaraderie of air crews broke down a lot of the usual Navy protocol. Military discipline was fairly relaxed on the base, not completely absent, but rather informal. That would change a bit when we were aboard ship, due somewhat to the fact that on ships it was the real Navy, not the Airedale's Navy. The food was about what one expected, just average. But there was always plenty of it, and it was available at most hours, which was nice, as we were flying day and night. I doubt that any of us ever stationed anywhere that the mess hall wasn't one of the biggest gripes and a major part of many conversations. Dick Gingrich, a pilot in VPB 216, editor of the Mariner Marlin newsletter, in a 1995 article made the telling comment that Harvey Point was the only air station in the continental U.S. that served overseas rations like powdered eggs and baked beans for breakfast 3 to 4 times a week. I never drank coffee until I went in the Navy, when I learned that the Navy runs on coffee, always served in porcelain mugs with no handles. We drank it with sugar and canned milk. Food was usually dumped on our 3-section metal trays by surly mess cooks. Mess cooks had one of the worst jobs in the Navy, often used as punishment, because the quality of the food was always blamed on them, even though they were only servers and had nothing to do with its preparation. But like most diners who are dissatisfied with their food, we blamed the servers, not the chef or those who decided on the food to be served. I remember some of the officers of VB-21 sensed that morale among the enlisted troops was pretty low. An officer was appointed to talk to us at morning muster and gave a morale booster speech. He talked of the poor conditions on the base and asked us to put up with them a little longer, as we'd be leaving soon for better places. Not that we had any choice. He ended his speech with the following: "Take comfort in the fact the conditions are as bad as they can get. They can't get any worse. Did he know never say never, and that things would certainly get worse?" I personally found that morale was almost always high during my tour with the squadron. There was some negativity about some of the officers and one chief petty officer, but they were exceptions. The only other gripe was about food. I was fortunate that one of the base personnel, who I knew, lived not far from where I lived, just outside Washington, D.C., and he drove home every weekend. A couple of times when I could arrange it, I bummed a ride with him, made a nice break in the routine. This was a growing up period for me. I had always had a comfortable life with no real adversity, and I had learned so much in the year and a half I'd been in the Navy about other people and the world in general. Ground training. There was a good deal of emphasis on ground training activities for both officers and enlisted men who were sent off to schools such as radar, gunnery, and celestial navigation. Many of us went off to gunnery school at Dam Neck, Virginia, near Norfolk, for further training. We spent about 5 days there, firing from turrets mounted on trucks that would speed up and down a road at the firing range while we fired at stationary targets. An interesting sidelight: one day of training at Dam Neck was devoted to the use of small arms. One of our instructors in the use of 45 caliber, 38 caliber, and 45 caliber submachine guns was an interesting guy. He professed that before joining the Navy, he had taught shooting at a gun range in Chicago. In his best tough guy language, he said, "I taught a guy named Al Capone how to shoot." So we all felt like experts after a day with him. Flight physicals. We occasionally had to take flight physicals, and unfortunately for me, we had a by-the-book flight surgeon, Harvey Point. He was on my case as I was over the weight stipulated for aircrewmen. He threatened to have me grounded, and that just about killed me. However, my no liquid, no food diet for 48 hours always pulled me through. I just wish that the other doctors and dentists I met during my Navy career were as thorough and cautious as he was. The general rule was that if you were warm, breathing, and upright, you were healthy. Interestingly, most people rejected by draft boards in World War II as physically unfit did not have physical disabilities but serious dental problems. Liberty towns. The point was made earlier that there are not any great liberty towns nearby, so most of us hung around the base or journeyed into Hertford for dinner and a beer or two. It was an experience to get to town unless you're fortunate enough to know someone with a car. Otherwise, you rode a bus up the 2-lane country road 11 miles to Hertford. From Hertford, you could catch a Greyhound bus to other destinations. I made a number of trips to Elizabeth City with John Williams of Crew 6. He was not an imposing physical figure, just a country boy from Tennessee. But he was sure that he was a Southern gentleman, and he was quite the ladies' man. He had all the lines, and I recall one of his techniques was to go to church on Sunday morning. He always said it's the best place to meet young women because they're impressed you're there. On one of my trips, I did get picked up on the Greyhound bus one afternoon by an attractive young lady, and we spent an enjoyable evening socializing. Overall, though, I say the group for the most part was pretty celibate during our stay at Harvey Point. We had occasional beer parties on base, and the officers had their own club on base. Not quite the top of the mark, but quite adequate for a quiet evening drink or two. There was one humorous incident I recall, which became a legend in the squadron. One evening, 5 of us decided to have a couple of cold beers at a local juke joint. We entered and sat in the booth with M.D. Wood sitting in the chair at the end of the booth. The waitress came by and said, "What do you guys have?" Wood turned to me and said, "What do you have, sweet?" Then he said to the guy sitting next to me, "What do you have, dear?" Then the next guy, "What do you have, angel?" And last but not least, to the last guy, "What do you have, darling?" The waitress wasn't quite sure what was happening until we told her they were our real last names: Don Sweet, Don Dear, Bruce Angel, and Ron Darling. Aloha, Hawaii. In early June 44, Squadron VP 21 received orders to proceed to the West Coast for transfer to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The crews were well indoctrinated and functioning smoothly, and morale was high. We were ready to go. Most of us got 5 days leave, and I headed home and enjoyed the good life for a brief period. Home for most of us was a time for good food, sleeping in, greeting a parade of relatives and neighbors, and seeing the old girlfriends. We returned with youthful enthusiasm, even though we'd had some ill fortune during our 3 months of training.